The cold settled over Redford like an old unspoken memory that refused to leave. Snow drifted lazily outside the windows of Earl's diner, clinging to the glass before melting into silence. Inside, the warmth from the grill and the low hum of idle conversations created a cocoon of familiarity for the town's regulars. The kind of warmth that made strangers feel like neighbors, and neighbors feel like family. But for one man sitting alone at table 9, that warmth never quite reached past the edge of his plate. His name was Walter Briggs. He had been coming to Earl's every Thursday night for the past 7 years without fail, always arriving at exactly 6:15, always requesting the same booth, the one near the window where he could watch the snowfall and let his thoughts drift somewhere far from the present. Walter was a tall man once, proud in posture and presence, but the years had softened his edges and curved his back. His army green jacket, threadbare and patched at the elbow, still bore the ghost of medals long put away. One sleeve hung empty, folded and pinned neatly where his right arm should have been. The loss, like many in his life, was something he never discussed. Not with the staff, not with the regulars, not even with the curious young boy who used to stare from behind the counter until his mother pulled him away. Walter never raised his voice, never asked for special treatment. He simply came in, nodded respectfully to anyone who made eye contact, and ordered the same thing every time. Scrambled eggs, 2 slices of wheat toast, and black coffee. No sugar, no cream. The waitress, Maggie, a kind woman in her late 40s with crow's feet and a voice like warm syrup, would always bring his order without needing to ask. She often added an extra butter packet without charging him, though Walter never commented on it. He just nodded with the faintest smile of appreciation. That night the diner was busier than usual. A basketball game had just ended at the local high school, and the town's energy was palpable. Parents, teenagers, and couples filled the booths and stools with conversation, laughter, and the occasional shout across tables. Walter remained silent, sipping his coffee, lost in the quiet world behind his eyes. He had seen much louder nights, after all. Nights lit by flares instead of neon signs, filled with screams instead of clinking forks. But he had made peace with the noise. It was the silence that lingered after the battle that stayed with him. As he sat there, staring into his coffee, the front door opened with a clang of the bell, ushering in a gust of cold air and a group of 4 young men, no older than 20. They entered like they owned the place, laughing, talking too loudly, and immediately drawing the eyes of those nearby. Dressed in college hoodies, ball caps turned backward, and sneakers that squeaked on the linoleum floor, they headed straight for a booth 3 tables away from Walter. One of them, tall, sharp-jawed, and clearly the leader, noticed Walter first. His smirk curled slightly as he elbowed his friend and nodded toward the old man. The others followed his gaze, and in an instant, the mood shifted. They whispered, at first just low enough to pretend they were not being cruel. But cruelty does not need to be loud to be heard. One of them chuckled and muttered, "Bet he cannot even hold a spoon with that stump." Another mimicked a limp as he walked past Walter's table to grab extra napkins. They returned to their booth, laughing louder now, as if the veteran sitting only feet away was invisible, or worse, irrelevant. Walter said nothing. His expression never changed. He simply took another sip of coffee, his hand steady despite the insult, and kept his eyes on the falling snow outside. His face, weathered and creased by time, bore no reaction, though his eyes blinked a fraction slower. Inside, something shifted. Pain, perhaps, or the quiet understanding that some wars never end. They only change shape. The waitress noticed the shift in tone but hesitated. She looked toward the group, then at Walter, and then turned quickly back to the counter. No one else spoke up. Not the older couple in the booth nearby, not the cook behind the window, not the man reading the newspaper at the far corner table. The young men grew bolder, more animated. One of them rolled a napkin into a fake grenade and tossed it gently toward Walter's table. It landed just short, skidding to a stop near his boot. The laughter was loud now, obnoxious. But Walter did not move. He did not flinch. He did not give them the satisfaction. To anyone watching, it may have looked like he had not even heard them. But he had, every word, every insult, every cruel joke wrapped in a chuckle. And still he sat. The quiet man at table 9, a storm once, now calm, but not broken, never broken. What they did not know, what they could not begin to understand, was that Walter Briggs had once stood in a jungle half a world away with bullets whizzing past his ear and watched his closest friend die in his arms. He had crawled through mud with a shattered arm, refusing to let the enemy reach his platoon. He had faced men who hated him with a fury far deeper than the empty cruelty of bored youth. And he had returned home not to parades or praise, but to silence, to stares, to being forgotten. Now, decades later, in a town that had no idea who he truly was, he was mocked for what they could not begin to fathom. The diner continued to buzz around him. Orders were shouted to the kitchen, glasses clinked, the heater hummed. And at table 9, a veteran stared through the glass as snow piled slowly outside, covering the sidewalks like a blanket hiding the scars beneath. He took another bite of his toast, chewing slowly, and when the leader of the group dared to walk past again looking for a final moment of amusement, Walter looked up, just for a second. Their eyes met. The young man flinched, because in that one glance, he saw something he did not expect, not anger, not fear, just the cold, unwavering eyes of a man who had once stared death in the face and did not blink. A man who had known real loss, real sacrifice, real pain. And in that look, the boy realized, without fully understanding why, that he was not looking at someone weak. He was looking at someone who had chosen restraint when he could have chosen rage. A quiet man, yes, but not a broken one. And just as the boy turned away, shaken but too proud to show it, another figure finally stirred from the far corner of the diner. He had been silent all along, hidden behind a newspaper and a slice of untouched pecan pie, but now he folded the paper slowly with purpose and set it down. He rose, towering over his booth. His posture was perfect, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp and focused. No one knew him. Not yet. But something about his presence made the air feel heavier. Something in his stance said he was not just any man. He watched everything with the discipline of someone trained to calculate risk in seconds. He had seen enough, and though he did not say a word, not yet, the diner was about to fall silent in a way it had not in years. Because sometimes, justice does not come in shouting or violence. Sometimes it comes from the quiet force of someone who understands exactly when to stand and exactly how to be heard without ever opening his mouth. Colonel James Rourke sat alone at the far corner booth of Earl's Diner, where the light from the overhead bulb flickered faintly against the surface of his untouched slice of pecan pie. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and upright even in stillness, the sort of presence that did not ask for attention but commanded it nonetheless. His hands, weathered and marked by decades of discipline, rested on either side of a folded newspaper that he had not turned in several minutes. Though the pages were open to a headline about rising fuel prices, his eyes had not been reading. They were locked, still and hard as granite, on the group of young men 3 tables away, who had spent the better part of the last 20 minutes humiliating a man Colonel Rourke recognized as a brother in arms the moment he walked in. Rourke had not planned on stopping here. He was merely passing through Redford on his way to attend the funeral of a fellow Marine, Sergeant Harold Keene, a comrade who had saved his life more than once in Kandahar. He had driven for 4 hours in silence, letting the road give him space to remember. Earl's Diner, lit like a memory from simpler times, had called to him as a place to breathe, sit down, and eat something warm before the next stretch of highway. He had expected coffee and quiet. What he received instead was the bitter taste of disgrace. As soon as he heard the first snicker, his eyes flicked toward the source, and when he saw the target, an older man with a folded sleeve and posture that screamed soldier even in stillness, his entire demeanor shifted. Rourke was a man who had seen too much to react to every insult or provocation, but there were things he simply could not let pass. Not when they cut this deep. He knew immediately who the man at Table 9 was, or at least what he had been. The missing arm, the steeled silence, the unshakable composure amidst mockery. These were traits learned through pain, refined by war. Rourke recognized them because he had lived them. His jaw clenched as the boys grew louder, their ignorance turning into something crueler with every minute. One of them, in an attempt to impress the others, fumbled with a salt shaker like it, was a grenade and let it roll across the floor toward the veteran's boots. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath for a beat, but then someone laughed and the spell was broken. Rourke's fists curled around the edges of his seat, but still, he did not move. He watched, judging, calculating. There was always a right moment, and it was not yet. The waitress Maggie looked at Rourke from across the counter. Their eyes met only for a second, but in that glance, something passed between them. She had served this veteran for years, always worried someone would say something they could not take back. And now that moment had arrived. But she saw something in Rourke's eyes, something that made her nod once and turn away. It was not approval exactly. It was trust. She knew this man, though she had never met him before. Knew him the same way she knew Walter. They were men built from the same steel, carried by the same codes. And just as she stepped back into the kitchen, the tall boy in the cap, the ringleader, rose from his seat and strutted over to Walter's table. The diner had grown quieter, the laughter dimming now, curiosity creeping in. People sensed something was shifting. The boy leaned down, hands on the table, and said loudly, "Hey, hero, want me to chew your food too?" The silence that followed felt immediate, thick like smoke. Even his friends stopped chuckling, sensing a boundary had just been crossed. Walter did not respond. He simply blinked slowly, then looked past the boy toward the corner booth, and that is when Colonel Rourke finally stood up. He did not speak. He did not need to. The air changed around him as he rose, like a mountain lifting from the earth. Every motion was deliberate, from the way he folded his newspaper and set it beside his plate, to the precise push of his chair beneath the table. His boots made no sound, but his presence shouted through the diner. He straightened his jacket, a dark wool coat with a faint military trim, and stepped forward, his steps slow, measured, as though he was counting each one. He was not moving quickly, yet it felt like the ground shifted beneath him. All eyes turned toward him now. Conversations fell silent. Forks stopped mid-air. The young men who had been laughing just moments ago now sat stiffly, watching this stranger cross the room like a man walking onto a battlefield. The boy at Walter's table turned, confused, defensive, but when he saw the colonel's face, something faltered in his chest. Rourke had not changed his expression, but his eyes, those eyes, were sharp as a bayonet and colder than the snow falling outside. There was no emotion in them, no anger, Just quiet, surgical judgment. He stopped at Walter's table, glanced down at the empty plate, then at the old man himself, and gave a slow nod, a soldier's nod. One that said, "I see you. I remember." Then, with all the care in the world, Rourke reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it silently and revealed a gleaming medal, the Purple Heart, and placed it on the table in front of Walter. But he was not finished. He reached again, deeper this time, and retrieved a second box, older, worn at the edges. Inside it rested a Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor in combat. He placed it beside the Purple Heart without ceremony, then stepped back and turned his full attention to the boys. Still silent, still towering. And in that moment, the entire diner seemed to shrink beneath him. The boys were frozen, pale. None of them moved. The leader, the one who had made the cruel remark, swallowed hard and tried to stand taller, but his voice caught in his throat. He opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to excuse, but nothing came out. Rourke said nothing. He simply stared. And it was that silence, so firm, so heavy, that did more than any speech could have. It stripped away the pretense, the performance, the false courage. It revealed the raw truth of who they were, boys pretending to be men, the kind who had never served, never suffered, never sacrificed anything for anyone but themselves. And now they stood before men who had done all three. Not just once, but again and again in places no one dared to remember. Walter finally spoke, just one word, so low it almost went unnoticed. "Thank you." Rourke nodded once more, picked up his coat from the back of his chair, and walked back to the corner booth. He did not take the medals with him. He left them where they belonged, at the table of a man who had earned them 1,000 times over. The pie remained untouched, forgotten. Rourke did not sit back down. He simply stood for a moment, eyes scanning the room, then turned toward the door. And as he walked out into the snow, not a single soul in the diner made a sound. Not the cook, not the waitress, not the customers. The group of boys remained in stunned silence, their smirks gone, replaced by the heavy realization that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. They had mocked a hero, and worse, they had done it, thinking there would be no consequence, but there had been. And it had arrived not in anger, but in quiet, disciplined dignity. As the door shut behind Colonel Rourke, the wind carried a gust of cold that rippled through the diner like a reminder. A reminder that real strength is not loud. It does not scream. It does not seek attention. Real strength stands, watches, waits, and acts only when it must. And when it does, it changes everything. The moment the diner's glass door swung shut behind Colonel Rourke, a silence fell heavier than any words could have managed. It was not the kind of silence that comes from absence. It was the kind that demands presence. It pressed against the walls, weighed down the air, and made every single person inside feel suddenly, sharply, small. The medals still lay on the table in front of Walter, catching light like holy relics beneath the dull glow of the overhead bulb. The Purple Heart shimmered faintly, its crimson ribbon lying still against the worn surface of the table. Beside it, the Navy Cross rested with solemn gravity, its metal edges gleaming like a blade drawn halfway. Walter had not touched either of them. His remaining hand lay flat on the table, fingers splayed slightly, as if afraid that any movement might disturb the weight of the moment. Across the room, the boys who had laughed just minutes earlier now sat in complete stillness. Their arrogance had evaporated, and in its place was a strange choking blend of shame, confusion, and something far rarer, humility. None of them dared to look directly at Walter, and none could forget the look that Colonel Rourke had given them. No shouting, no lectures, just that unblinking, unimpressed gaze that exposed every crack in their posturing. That stare had said more than 1,000 words could. You are in the presence of giants. And giants did not scream. They did not throw fists or beg for respect. They simply were. And you felt it. The boys had not understood it at first. To them, Walter had been just another old man, one who moved slowly and carried his tray with one arm. They saw weakness where there was actually survival, disability where there was unspeakable strength. But then that man had been acknowledged, honored, by a figure so commanding, so clearly revered, that the truth had come crashing down on them like thunder. They had mocked a man whose courage made theirs look like dust. The leader of the group, a tall boy with a backwards cap and a voice that had filled the diner only moments ago, now sat hunched in his seat, jaw clenched, face pale. His friends stared straight ahead or down at their food, afraid even to breathe, too loudly. The weight of what they had done was finally catching up with them, and it was not subtle. It was devastating. Walter sat still. He had not touched his burger. He had not sipped from his coffee. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the metals before him, as if trying to reconcile what had just happened with what he had spent years trying to forget. His mind drifted, uninvited, uncontrollably, to memories long buried, the flash of light from an IED just outside of Fallujah, the way his left arm had been there 1 second, then gone the next, the unbearable silence that had followed. He remembered the hospital, the endless days of recovery, the loss not just of his limb but of his identity. He had gone home to a world that had moved on without him, where people whispered, stared, or simply looked away. Not many people had ever called him a hero. Fewer still had seen him. But Colonel Rourke had, without hesitation, without needing an explanation. And that moment, that silent recognition, had cracked something open inside him that had not been touched in years. The diner staff moved slowly now, careful not to break the silence. Maggie emerged from the kitchen, her eyes flickering to the table and widening slightly when she saw the medals. She said nothing but placed a fresh cup of coffee beside Walter's hand, her fingers brushing his just for a second. A small gesture, but it carried more warmth than a dozen apologies. She then turned and walked toward the group of boys, her expression unreadable. She stopped beside their table and cleared her throat, gently but firmly. "Gentlemen," she said, "if you are finished with your meals, I suggest you pay your bill." Her tone was polite but final. One by one, the boys reached for their wallets, moving slowly, clumsily. The leader fumbled with a crumpled 20, his hands shaking, just enough for Maggie to notice. She did not gloat, she did not smirk. She simply took the bills and said, "Next time you think twice before opening your mouth." And then she walked away, letting her words settle like ash. As the boys made their way out, none of them looked back. They moved like men who had walked into a room as one thing and left as something else entirely. The lesson had been silent, but it had cut deeper than any slap across the face. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, coating the parking lot in a soft white blanket. The leader of the group stood near the curb for a moment, staring at the ground, his face tight. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the window, where Walter sat inside. Their eyes met through the glass, just for a moment, and though no words passed between them, there was something there. Something raw, ashamed, and perhaps apologetic. Walter gave a slight nod, barely visible, It was enough. The boy turned and walked off into the snow. Inside the diner, the quiet began to shift. It was no longer heavy with shock. It had transformed into something more reverent. The older couple at the table near the window leaned in toward each other and whispered. The man who had been reading a newspaper earlier now stared at the medals with quiet awe. Even the cook peeking through the kitchen service window had tears in his eyes. And Walter? Walter finally picked up the Navy Cross with his hand and stared at it for a long time. His lips trembled just once. Then he sat, the medal back down and straightened in his seat. He no longer felt invisible. That small fire inside him, the one that had nearly died, was glowing again. Rourke had not just stood up for him. He had reminded everyone in that room who Walter truly was. And perhaps more importantly, he had reminded Walter himself. Outside, just beyond the diner's frosted window, a set of tire tracks showed where a large black SUV had pulled away moments earlier. Colonel Rourke had left as quietly as he had come, vanishing into the snow-covered road like a ghost from a different time. But his presence lingered. His silence had reshaped the air inside that diner. It would not be forgotten. Not by the staff. Not by the customers. And certainly not by the boys whose laughter had turned to silence. Hours later, long after the lunch rush had passed and the diner had returned to its gentle hum of plates and silverware, Walter remained seated. He had finished his coffee. He had eaten a few bites of his burger, but mostly he sat in stillness, his hand resting gently beside the medals. People came and went. Some nodded to him as they passed. One man, a retired firefighter, judging by the patch on his jacket, paused just long enough to whisper, "Thank you for your service." Walter nodded back, his throat too tight to speak. It was not that he needed validation. It was that for so long he had accepted invisibility as part of the cost of service. But not today. Today, someone had seen him, truly seen him, and there were no words for what that meant. The sun began to set, casting long amber streaks through the diner's windows. Walter finally stood, slid the medals gently into his coat pocket, and picked up his tray. He moved toward the counter to return his dishes, but Maggie stopped him with a smile. "Already taken care of," she said softly. He blinked, unsure. "Your meal," she added. "The colonel paid for it before he left." Walter's lips twitched into something close to a smile. He looked toward the door, then down at the floor, then back at Maggie. "Tell him thank you if he ever comes back." Maggie nodded. "Oh, I think he already knows." Walter stepped out into the snow, the cold biting gently at his face. He paused for a moment, letting the wind hit him. It felt different now. Not harsh, not punishing, just clean. He turned the collar of his coat up and walked slowly down the sidewalk, the snow crunching beneath his boots, his back straighter than it had been in years. And inside Earl's diner, people kept eating, kept living. But something had changed forever. Because silence had fallen like thunder, and no one who had been there would ever forget what it had said. As the snow outside thickened into a soft curtain, the warmth inside Earl's diner remained tense and still. The air held that strange, sacred quality that only follows moments of reckoning, as if even time itself had taken a deep breath and now waited to exhale. Walter sat quietly, his medals resting in front of him, untouched. The Navy Cross and the Purple Heart shimmered faintly beneath the diner lights, as though absorbing everything. The shame, the silence, the echoes of what had just unfolded. Maggie kept herself busy behind the counter, wiping down an already clean surface, her back to the boys who were still frozen in their booth like schoolchildren caught in a lie far greater than they were prepared to face. They had not moved since Colonel Rourke left. The colonel's presence had hung over them like a storm, and even after he returned to his booth and picked up his fork as if nothing had happened, the atmosphere had not returned to normal. Rourke had not said a word since laying the medals on Walter's table. He simply finished his slice of apple pie slowly and methodically, the way only a man trained to be unbothered by noise and nonsense could, and yet his silence screamed. Finally, one of the young men, the loudest, the one who had made the disgusting joke about Walter's chewing, stood. It was not a proud movement. It was hesitant, jagged. His knees shook slightly as he stepped toward Walter's table, the hush in the diner tightening around him like a noose. He swallowed, looked down at the floor and cleared his throat. His voice cracked as he muttered, I am sorry, sir." Then, turning to Walter, his eyes darting everywhere but the old man's face, he added, "I am sorry. For real." The words barely made it out, but they were real. There was no defiance left in him, no smug grin, no half-hearted sarcasm. Just a boy, because that was all he really was, grappling with the weight of a truth he had never been taught, that honor walks softly, that real strength does not need to raise its voice, and that true courage sometimes limps through a diner alone and unnoticed until a Marine colonel brings it back into the light. Walter looked at him. His expression was not harsh. It was not angry. It was something far deeper, calm, tired, weathered by years of watching people rush past him in ignorance. And yet somehow, it was forgiving. He gave a small, slow nod, not enthusiastic, not generous, just honest. A gesture that said, "I hear you. I accept it. But do better." The boy stood frozen for a moment longer, then turned and walked out, his head bowed low. His friends followed, not one of them saying a word. No swagger, no smirks. Just the quiet footsteps of boys who had entered as loudmouths and left as witnesses to something their generation rarely sees up close: humility. As the door closed, behind them and the soft jingle of the bell faded into the snowstorm, something in the diner shifted. The silence remained, but it was no longer the kind bred by tension. It had become reverent. Walter turned back toward the window and let his eyes rest on the falling snow. He remembered days far colder than this, nights in foxholes with blood on his sleeves and screams in his ears, morning raids in a desert so hot his boots nearly melted to the ground. He remembered friends, good men, who never made it home, and he remembered how invisible he had felt since returning. Not because anyone said anything cruel, but because so many said nothing at all. Maggie approached him, gently placing a fresh napkin on the table, though his hands were already clean. She glanced at the medals, then at him, and smiled softly. "You all right, Mr. Walter?" she asked. He nodded, the lines around his eyes softening for the first time that afternoon. "Yes," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "Better than I've been in a long time." From across the room, Colonel Rourke stood. He dusted off the crumbs from his lap, picked up his coat, and slowly walked back toward Walter's table. Everyone in the diner watched as he approached, not because they expected a speech, but because they knew something was coming. Rourke stopped in front of Walter and looked down at the medals, then at the man who wore no uniform now but bore more scars than most could imagine. He did not speak. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. With deliberate care, he placed it beneath the Purple Heart, then looked Walter in the eye and gave a single, respectful nod, the kind only soldiers understand. Walter returned the nod, and that was enough. Rourke turned without another word and walked toward the door. As he reached it, a few patrons began to clap, quietly at first, then a little louder. Not an ovation, not a performance. Just a tribute. Respectful, earnest, honest. Rourke did not turn around. The door opened. Cold air spilled in. Snowflakes swirled briefly across the floor before the door shut again, and he was gone. Walter remained seated. He looked down at the note the colonel had left. It was written in careful block letters, the kind learned in military briefings and scribbled onto field reports. He who stands in silence speaks louder than cowards ever will. Rourke, Walter read it once, then twice, and then he folded it, placed it gently into his breast pocket beside the medals and let out a long, slow breath. He had not realized how tightly he had been holding on to the day until that moment. All the tension, the weight, the burden, it loosened. Just a little, but enough. He stood. As he made his way toward the counter, several diners nodded at him. One woman touched his arm gently and whispered, "Thank you." A man gave him a brief salute. Walter nodded to each, saying nothing, not out of pride, but because he had already said everything that mattered simply by being there. Maggie handed him his coat with a warm smile. "Your meal's taken care of, Mr. Walter." The colonel covered it. Walter blinked. He had suspected, but the confirmation still moved something inside him. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Maggie leaned in slightly. "No, sir, thank you." Walter stepped out into the snow. The wind greeted him not as an enemy but as an old companion. He pulled his coat tighter and walked slowly down the sidewalk, each step firm despite the ice. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Late afternoon shadows stretched long over the quiet town, and in the window of the diner, someone had drawn back the curtain to watch him go. Back inside, Maggie returned to her counter. The note still echoed in her mind. She walked over to the table, now empty, and gently picked up the coffee cup Walter had left behind. She stood there for a moment, looking at the chair, the folded napkin, the now absent medals. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a small black notebook, the kind they used to keep track of regulars' orders. She flipped to a blank page and in neat handwriting wrote, "Walter, Navy Cross, Purple Heart, sat alone until the world remembered who he was." She closed the book, tucked it away, and got back to work. But she would remember that day. So would everyone who had been there. Because sometimes a single act of quiet courage can change the temperature of a room forever. Sometimes silence is thunder, and sometimes the ones who leave without a word leave behind the loudest message of all.